Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy History Channel. Tonight, we are pulling back the heavy, woven tapestry of time to explore the shadowy and fascinating beginnings of a place that would eventually become known as England. We are going to journey together into the damp, misty world of the 5th century, a time of crumbling empires, dark churning seas, and the quiet, relentless march of human migration. When we think about the birth of the Anglo-Saxons and the foundation of English history, we are not looking at a single, sudden event. We are looking at a slow, creeping dawn. So I invite you to settle in. Let the tensions of your day melt away into the shadows and allow my voice to carry you across the cold, grey waters of the North Sea. To truly understand how England was born, we must first look at the magnificent, decaying shell of Roman Britannia. Picture it in your mind. For nearly 400 years, the Roman Empire had cast its vast organized shadow over the island. They had carved long, straight roads through ancient, tangled forests. They had built sweeping stone villas with heated floors, bustling market towns, and the imposing, wind-battered stretch of Hadrian's Wall in the north. But by the early 400s, the heartbeat of Rome was growing dangerously faint. The empire was bleeding from internal strife and external invasions. I find it truly fascinating how even the mightiest structures of human civilization can simply quietly hollow out before they fall. In the year 410, an event occurred that sent a quiet shockwave across the island. The local leaders of Britannia, terrified of the fierce Picts and Scots, raiding from the north, sent a desperate plea to the Roman Emperor Honorius, begging for military reinforcements. The emperor's reply is one of the most hauntingly final documents in history. Known as the Rescript of Honorius, it essentially told the Britons to look to their own defenses. The Roman legions packed their camps. Imagine the sound of thousands of leather sandals and iron-studded boots echoing on the cobblestones for the very last time. The clinking of armor, the slow fading of the eagle standards into the thick morning fog. They boarded their ships and sailed away, leaving a heavily Romanized population alone on an island surrounded by the unknown. When I reflect on this moment, it strikes me that the Britons were not just losing an army. They were losing a way of life. The grand stone baths slowly ran cold. The intricately painted plaster walls of the villas began to peel and crumble under the relentless dampness of the British weather. Grass and wild ivy began to push their way up through the cracks in the beautiful mosaic floors. The island was plunged into a strange, vulnerable silence, waiting for what would come next. And what came next arrived on the back of the eastern wind. Across the grey, rolling expanse of the North Sea, the shores of northern Europe were shifting. In the dense marshlands, the dark, towering pine forests, and the flat, wind-swept coasts of what is now modern-day Denmark, northern Germany, and the Netherlands, lived a collection of Germanic tribes. History remembers them primarily as the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. These were a people deeply connected to the harsh, unforgiving nature of their environment. They were farmers, hunters, and fiercely skilled seafarers. I often wonder what compelled them to leave their ancestral hearths. Perhaps it was rising sea levels flooding their coastal farms. Or perhaps it was the pressure of other tribes pushing them outward. Whatever the reason, they began to look across the water toward the green, fertile island that the Romans had abandoned. Let us stand for a moment on those ancient, muddy shores of Jutland. The air is biting and smells heavily of salt, wet peat, and wood smoke curling from the thatched roofs of their longhouses. Men and women are moving rhythmically, loading supplies into their ships. These were not the massive, dragon-headed longships of the later Viking age, but rather clinker-built vessels, constructed with overlapping oak planks, sealed with animal fat and tar to keep the freezing water out. It is hard to fathom the sheer bravery, or perhaps the sheer desperation, required to push these open wooden boats out into the violent, unpredictable swell of the North Sea, without compasses or maps, guided only by the pale stars and the flight of seabirds. The journey across would have been intensely difficult. Imagine huddled families wrapped in thick, coarse wool and animal furs, their faces stung by the freezing ocean spray, the rhythmic groaning of the wooden hull beneath them, the slapping of the dark water against the sides of the boat. For days they would exist in this wet, swaying purgatory, holding their children close, listening to the wind howling through the rigging. And then, finally, peering through the morning mist, they would see it. The white, chalk cliffs and the dark, forested shores of eastern Britannia. According to later historical texts, like the writings of the monk Mead, the very first of these Germanic arrivals were not invaders, but mercenaries. The story goes that a British king named Vortigern, desperate to protect his lands from northern raiders, invited two Jutish brothers, Hengist and Horsa, to bring their warriors across the sea to fight for him. In exchange, they were granted land in the eastern region known as Kent. When you look deeply at history, you realize that borders are rarely crossed first by conquering armies. They are usually crossed by people simply looking for a piece of earth to call their own, or by those invited to do a job no one else wants to do. The arrival of Hengist and Horsa opened the door. Soon, word drifted back across the North Sea. The land in Britannia was incredibly rich, the soil dark and fertile, and the native people were fragmented and struggling to mount a unified defense. And so, the Great Migration began in earnest. Small fleets of ships began landing all along the eastern and southern coasts of the island. They dragged their wooden ships up onto the pebbled beaches, stepping off into the freezing mud, gripping iron-tipped spears and round wooden shields. But they did not just bring weapons. They brought their entire world with them. They brought their families, their hunting dogs, their livestock, and their gods. They brought the seeds they would plant in this new, foreign soil. It is deeply moving to picture these new arrivals building their first fires on the beaches of Britain, watching the sparks drift up into the strange, damp night sky, knowing they would never see the homelands of their ancestors again. Slowly, they began to move inland, following the river valleys, settling in the shadows of the decaying Roman ruins that must have looked to them like the abandoned castles of giants. As they moved inward, the landscape they encountered was a haunting mix of the wild and the forgotten. The great Roman roads, constructed with such rigid precision, still cut straight lines across the rolling green hills, but the new arrivals largely ignored them. To the Anglo-Saxons, the crumbling stone cities of the Romans, with their dead, cold walls and echoing empty streets, were places of dark magic and lingering ghosts. They called them the work of giants, as we mentioned before, and they chose instead to build their lives in the embrace of the deep, living forests and the wide, winding river valleys. I often think about how strange it must have felt for them, standing amidst the monumental ruins of a fallen empire, choosing instead the quiet intimacy of a wooden hall, built with their own hands. They began to establish small, tight-knit communities, clearing patches of ancient woodland to make way for their crops. The rhythm of their lives was entirely dictated by the slow turning wheel of the seasons. In the spring, the dark earth was turned by heavy wooden ploughs drawn by slow, muscular oxen. You can almost hear the soft, rhythmic thud of hooves in the muddy soil, the creak of the leather harnesses, and the calls of the farmers echoing in the crisp morning air. They planted barley, wheat, and oats, relying entirely on the mercy of the British weather to sustain them through the harsh winters to come. The heart of these new settlements was the Mead Hall. This was not just a building. It was the absolute center of their universe. Picture a long rectangular structure built from massive, rough-hewn oak timbers, its steeply pitched roof heavily thatched with dried reeds gathered from the marshlands. Inside, the atmosphere was dense and alive. There were no windows, only the warm, golden glow of a massive central hearth fire that sent thick, fragrant wood smoke spiraling up to a hole in the roof. When I close my eyes, I can almost smell that unique blend of roasting meats, spilled ale, wet wool, and ancient ash. It was around these fires that the true soul of the Anglo-Saxons was forged. After a long day of grueling labor in the damp fields, the community would gather inside. The elders would take their places on carved wooden benches, wrapped in furs against the draughts that crept in through the wattle-and-daub walls. Here, they did not read from books, for they were a people of the spoken word. Instead, the scop, or the storyteller, would step into the firelight, plucking the gut strings of a small wooden lyre. The scop would begin to weave tales of ancient heroes, fierce battles, dark monsters lurking in the fens, and the heavy, inescapable hand of fate, which they called word. It is deeply fascinating to me that these stories, born in the flickering shadows of wooden halls, were the very first seeds of English literature. They brought with them the oral traditions that would eventually become the great epic of Beowulf. As the storyteller's voice rose and fell with the crackling of the flames, the listeners would lean in, their faces illuminated by the fire, entirely captivated. The darkness outside the hall, filled with the howling wind and the unknown dangers of the British wilderness, simply faded away. Inside, there was warmth, kinship, and the reassuring continuity of their shared history. Life in these early settlements was undeniably hard, a constant, quiet struggle against the elements. The women were the silent pillars of this society, their days consumed by a relentless cycle of essential tasks. They were the weavers, the brewers, the healers, and the keepers of the hearth. Imagine a woman sitting by the doorway of a small, sunken house, the pale afternoon light catching the steady, hypnotic movement of her hands as she spins rough sheep's wool into yarn, using a simple wooden drop spindle. Her fingers are calloused but remarkably deft, creating the very fabric that will keep her family alive when the frost inevitably returns. Beside her, iron pots simmer over glowing coals, filling the air with the earthy scent of a root vegetable stew. As the decades slipped quietly by, these scattered, isolated communities began to take deeper root in the soil of Britannia. They slowly pushed further west and north, following the natural arteries of the rivers. They encountered the native Britons, and the interactions were a complex, messy tapestry of violent skirmishes, uneasy truces, and gradual assimilation. History is rarely a clean line of one people replacing another. Instead, it is a slow, messy blending of bloodlines, languages, and cultures. The native Britons did not simply vanish. Many of them adapted, learning the language of the newcomers, adopting their customs, and quietly weaving their own ancient traditions into the fabric of this emerging society. As these invisible lines of culture blurred and merged, the very map of the island began to change. The old Celtic and Roman names for rivers, valleys, and hills slowly faded, replaced by the guttural, earthy sounds of Old English. Whenever I look at a modern map of England, I am endlessly captivated by the suffixes that end so many towns and villages. Places ending in ham, ton, or ing. These are not just arbitrary letters, they are the literal, breathing echoes of those early chieftains. An ing meant the people or the family of a specific leader. A ham was a home or a settlement. So, when you walk the quiet streets of a village called Reading or Nottingham today, you are walking through the ancient, invisible footprint of a Saxon family who staked their claim in the damp dirt 1,500 years ago. But these people did not just map the physical landscape, they mapped a complex, terrifying, and beautiful spiritual landscape as well. Before the gentle bells of Christianity echoed across the shires, the Anglo-Saxons were a deeply pagan people. They worshipped a pantheon of gods who were as harsh and unpredictable as the North Sea they had crossed. Woden, the one-eyed god of war, wisdom, and poetry, was the chief among them. Thunor, the god of thunder, wielded his mighty hammer across the stormy skies, while Frigg oversaw the home, the harvest, and the deeply rooted magic of the earth. I find it fascinating how they didn't typically build grand stone temples to house these deities. Instead, their faith was intensely tied to the natural world. Imagine walking deep into an ancient, primeval forest as the sun begins to set. The canopy above is so thick that the light turns a bruised shade of purple and gold. In a secluded clearing, surrounded by ancient, twisting oak trees, you find a sacred grove. A local priest, draped in a heavy cloak of wolf fur, stands before a large wooden idol carved directly from the trunk of a fallen tree. The face of the god is weathered, staring out with solemn, hollow eyes. The priest is gently placing a small offering of barley, honey, and wildflowers at the roots. To ensure a surviving harvest, his face tilted downward in quiet reverence. It is a raw, visceral kind of spirituality, one that acknowledges the fragile, precarious balance between human survival and the overwhelming power of nature. They lived in a world where every rustling leaf, every sudden snap of a twig in the dark, and every crack of lightning held a deliberate divine meaning. The woods were alive with elves, water spirits, and unseen forces that had to be appeased or avoided entirely. Yet, despite the rugged, dirt-stained reality of their daily lives, these people possessed an artistic soul that was breathtakingly refined. It is one of history's great ironies that a culture living in smoky, wattle-and-daub huts produced some of the most exquisite, microscopic craftsmanship the world has ever seen. As local warlords began to consolidate their power, establishing the boundaries of the early kingdoms like Mercia, Wessex, and East Anglia, they demanded objects of immense beauty to display their newfound status. Picture the heavily calloused, dirt-stained hands of a Saxon metalworker. He sits near the glowing heat of a small charcoal forge inside a darkened workshop using incredibly fine iron tools. With the patience of the very earth itself, he is taking wafer-thin slices of red garnet imported from as far away as the fringes of the known world, and carefully setting them into intricate, geometric cells of pure, glittering gold. This technique, known as cloisonné, was used to create magnificent sword hilts, shoulder clasps, and heavy belt buckles that would gleam violently in the firelight of the Mead hall. When an Anglo-Saxon king wore these pieces, he was not just displaying his material wealth. He was wearing the captured light of the sun, projecting an aura of divine right and untouchable power to the loyal warriors who drank at his tables. As these kings gathered their loyal warriors around those heavy, mead-stoked wooden tables, the fragmented, chaotic map of Britannia began to harden into something more defined. The early days of hundreds of tiny, localized family tribes were slowly being swallowed up by larger, far more ambitious powers. We are entering the age that historians often call the Heptarchy, a Greek term that simply means the rule of seven. The island was slowly carving itself into 7 dominant kingdoms: Wessex, Sussex, and Essex in the south and east, Kent in the southeast corner, East Anglia jutting out into the cold sea, the vast, central powerhouse of Mercia, and the sprawling, untamed kingdom of Northumbria in the north. I often marvel at how these borders were not drawn with ink on paper, but were carved into the earth itself. They were defined by twisting rivers, ancient, impassable bogs, and massive earthen ridges built by the sweat of thousands of men. Picture a cold, grey morning along one of these disputed borders, perhaps the sprawling earthwork known as the Wansdyke. The mist is hanging low, clinging to the damp grass. A line of Mercian warriors stands along the ridge, their breath pluming in the freezing air. They are not the heavily armoured knights of the later Middle Ages. They wear simple iron helmets, gripping round wooden shields, painted with fierce, abstract beasts, and holding spears topped with cold iron. They stare out across the silent valley, watching the tree line for any movement from their West Saxon rivals. It was a time of immense, quiet tension, where peace was usually just a temporary exhaustion between raids. Yet, it was not entirely an age of blood and iron. As these kingdoms stabilized, a delicate network of trade began to stretch across the muddy tracts of the island. Settlements, known as wicks, began to flourish along the coastlines and major rivers. Places like Londonwick, the early, sprawling predecessor of modern London, became bustling hubs of activity. I like to imagine the sensory overload of those early river markets. If you were to walk along the muddy banks of the Thames in the early 600s, your nose would be hit by the sharp scent of raw leather, wood smoke, salted fish, and the damp, earthy smell of the river itself. You would hear a cacophony of languages as Frisian merchants from across the sea traded heavy glass beads, wine from the continent, and fine pottery for English wool and hunting dogs. It was a world deeply connected to the violent currents of the North Sea, but another current was about to wash ashore, one that would fundamentally change the very soul of the Anglo-Saxons. It was a change that did not arrive with the clash of swords, but with the quiet, rhythmic chanting of men in dark robes. In the year 597, a small boat landed on the shores of Kent. On board was a monk named Augustine, sent by Pope Gregory the Great in Rome. When I reflect on this moment, I am struck by the sheer audacity of Augustine's mission. He was stepping onto an island that Rome had abandoned centuries ago, an island now ruled by fierce, pagan warlords who worshipped thunder and war. And his goal was to convince them to kneel to a single, peaceful god. King Ethelbert of Kent, who was already married to a Christian Frankish princess named Bertha, agreed to meet these strange foreign men. However, being deeply superstitious, he insisted they meet outside, under the open sky, fearful that they might try to weave dark magic on him within the confines of a hall. Envision that breathtaking meeting. The pagan king sits on a heavy wooden throne beneath a massive ancient oak tree, surrounded by his fierce, heavily armed guards wrapped in wolf pelts. Approaching them through the tall, windswept grass is Augustine and his 40 monks. They are carrying a massive silver cross that catches the pale sunlight, and a painted image of their Saviour on a wooden board. They are singing softly in Latin, a beautiful, alien sound drifting on the wind, carrying the ghosts of the old Roman Empire back to the shores of Britannia. King Ethelbert did not immediately fall to his knees and cast aside the gods of his ancestors. He was a practical man, a hardened warlord, who understood the deep, terrifying roots of the old ways. Yet, he was moved by the quiet, unshakable conviction of these strange men, and perhaps influenced by his Christian queen, he granted Augustine and his monks a plot of land in his capital of Canterbury. He gave them permission to preach, to build, and to gently weave their new narrative into the fabric of his kingdom. I find it so beautifully poetic that when these monks began to build their first places of worship, they did not start from scratch. Instead, they sought out the crumbling, ivy-choked ruins of the old Roman buildings that had stood abandoned for 200 years. Picture these monks, their dark robes hitched up around their knees, their hands stained with damp earth, clearing centuries of overgrowth from the ancient Roman red bricks. They gathered the shattered tiles and the fallen stones of a forgotten empire and stacked them back together. binding them with fresh mortar. The new faith of the island was literally and physically built upon the ruins of its past. Gradually, the persistent, peaceful rhythm of the monks began to soften the edges of the kingdom. Eventually, King Ethelbert himself chose to be baptized. Imagine the profound weight of that moment. The sky is a pale, milky white, reflecting off the shivering surface of a local river. The king, a man whose entire life had been defined by the blood of his enemies and the fierce pride of his warrior ancestors, steps barefoot into the freezing, dark water. Augustine, murmuring prayers in the soft, rhythmic cadence of Latin, cups the icy water in his hands and pours it over the scarred, weathered head of the king. The heavy silence of the watching retinue is broken only by the sound of the dripping water and the sigh of the wind through the barren trees. It was a baptism that would send a slow, inexorable ripple across the entire island. But history, especially the history of human belief, is never a sudden, clean break. When I reflect on this period of transition, I am always struck by the immense pragmatism of the Anglo-Saxon people. They did not simply abandon the gods of the earth and the storm overnight. Instead, a fascinating, muddy blending of faiths began to take place. Pope Gregory, writing back to Augustine from Rome, offered a piece of incredibly shrewd advice. He told the monks not to destroy the old pagan temples, but rather to remove the idols, sprinkle the shrines with holy water, and convert them into churches. Because of this, the transition was gentle, almost imperceptible to the common folk. A farmer might walk along the exact same forest path his grandfather had walked to pray for a good harvest. He would enter the same timber building, built on the same sacred mound. But now, instead of the heavy scent of animal sacrifice and the hollow stare of a wooden idol, the air was thick with the sweet, drifting smoke of frankincense, and an altar to Christ stood where the old gods once rested. Yet, in the quiet, desperate moments of a harsh winter, that same farmer might still leave a small secret offering of oats at the edge of his field for the elves and the land spirits. The human heart is remarkably capable of holding on to the ancient, while reaching for the new, hedging its bets against the vast, unforgiving dark. As Christianity slowly, stubbornly put down roots, it brought with it something utterly revolutionary. It brought the written word. Before the arrival of the monks, the history, the laws, and the soul of the Anglo-Saxons existed entirely in the breath of the storyteller and the memories of the elders. But inside the newly established monasteries, places like Lindisfarne in the north and Canterbury in the south, a quiet, painstaking revolution was taking place in dark, stone-walled rooms known as Scriptoriums. Let us step inside one of these freezing, dimly lit rooms. The air is terribly cold, so cold that the ink sometimes threatens to freeze in its horn. A lone monk sits at an angled wooden desk, bundled in layers of heavy, undyed wool, his breath forming small, white clouds in the still air. He holds a freshly sharpened goose quill in his ink-stained fingers. He is leaning over a large, smooth sheet of vellum, which is carefully prepared calfskin. With agonizing slowness and absolute precision, he dips his quill and touches it to the page. You can hear the soft, rhythmic scratch, scratch scratch of the nib as he forms the sweeping curves of Latin letters. He is capturing the ephemeral voice of a king's law, or the holy words of a gospel, trapping time itself onto the skin of an animal, so that it might outlive them all. Through these frozen, numb fingers, the Anglo-Saxons were finally stepping out of the mist of myth and stepping onto the solid, recorded pages of history. As those fragile pages of vellum multiplied within the cold stone walls, a new kind of power began to radiate across the damp, wind-swept island. It was not the raw, bloody power of the iron spear or the roaring hearth fire, but the quiet, enduring power of knowledge, organization, and spiritual authority. The monasteries themselves began to transform the physical landscape of Britannia. They grew from small, humble wooden shelters into sprawling, self-sustaining communities that functioned almost like small cities. When I close my eyes and picture these early monastic settlements, my mind always drifts northward, up the rugged, battered coastline to the kingdom of Northumbria. It is here, clinging to a tidal island known as Lindisfarne, or the Holy Island, that the true, luminous heart of this era began to beat. Imagine standing on the muddy shore of the mainland. Twice a day, the dark, freezing waters of the North Sea rush in, completely swallowing the causeway and cutting the island off from the rest of the world. It is a place of profound, enforced isolation. You can hear the mournful cries of the gulls and the relentless, rhythmic crashing of the waves against the dark rocks. To the monks who lived there, this isolation was not a punishment. It was a profound spiritual embrace. They sought the edges of the known world to strip away worldly distractions. The daily life of a monk on Lindisfarne was a grueling but deeply peaceful cycle of prayer and physical labor. While some worked in the Scriptorium, others were out in the biting coastal wind, their dark, heavy wool robes tied up with rope as they tended to massive flocks of hardy sheep. These sheep provided the meat for the winter, the heavy wool that kept them from freezing, and the countless skins required to make the vellum for their precious books. Others worked in the monastery gardens, cultivating herbs for medicine and tending to the woven willow skeps that housed their bees. There is something incredibly grounding about the image of a silent, bearded monk moving slowly among the buzzing hives in the pale afternoon sun. The bees were vital. They provided the rich honey needed to sweeten their coarse bread and brew their mead. But more importantly, they provided the pure beeswax that was melted and poured to create the thick candles that illuminated the dark, freezing hours of their midnight prayers. It was in this harsh, salty, wind-battered environment that the Anglo-Saxons produced a masterpiece of human devotion that still takes my breath away, the Lindisfarne Gospels. I find it absolutely mesmerizing how the harshest, most unforgiving environments often inspire the most staggering, luminous art. The monks did not simply copy the Latin words of the Bible. They elevated them into a vibrant, swirling visual explosion of faith. Picture the master illuminator sitting in his cell, the roar of the ocean echoing through the small window. He is not just using dark ink. He has small clay pots filled with the most vibrant, expensive colors the ancient world could provide. He has yellow made from crushed arsenic sulfide, greens from copper, and a breathtaking, deep blue created from lapis lazuli that had been traded across thousands of miles from the mountains of Afghanistan, passing through countless hands just to reach this freezing, lonely rock in the North Sea. What makes these pages so uniquely beautiful is that the monks did not abandon their ancestral roots when they embraced their new god. If you look closely at the illuminated letters, you will see a stunning, complex marriage of cultures. The swirling, hypnotic knotwork of the native Celtic traditions is woven seamlessly together with the fierce, biting animal motifs of the pagan Anglo-Saxons. Strange, elongated beasts, wolves and birds intertwine, biting their own tails, forming the very shapes of the holy Latin letters. It was as if the wild, untamed soul of the old world was being carefully, lovingly harnessed to carry the message of the new. This cultural flourishing marked a period often remembered as the Northumbrian Golden Age. The kings of the north, men like Edwin and Oswald, became incredibly powerful figures who blended the fierce, unyielding pride of the pagan warlord with the righteous, organizing zeal of the Christian king. They built massive wooden halls, funded the great monasteries, and sent missionaries out into the dense, dark forests of the neighboring kingdoms. They traveled with retinues of armed warriors, but they also traveled with the cross, using their newfound faith as a powerful tool to unify fractured tribes, solidify their own divine right to rule, and slowly stitch the scattered people of the island into something resembling a single, cohesive tapestry. Yet, even as the chants of the monks drifted over the hills, and the kings sat heavy on their wooden thrones, adorned with glittering gold and garnets, the dark waters of the North Sea were not empty. The same cold waves that had brought the Anglo-Saxons to these shores centuries ago were still out there, deep and churning, waiting to bring the next great storm. For decades, the Anglo-Saxons had looked out at the ocean and seen only a protective barrier, a vast grey moat that kept the chaos of the wider world safely at bay. But the sea is a treacherous thing, and it is entirely indifferent to the prayers of men. It serves as a highway for anyone bold enough to navigate its temperamental waters. And far to the north, in the deep, freezing fjords of Scandinavia, a people who had mastered the art of the sea were turning their hungry gaze toward the wealthy, undefended coasts of Britain. We mark the beginning of this terrifying new chapter in the year 793. It was the 8th of June, a time of year when the harsh Northumbrian winter finally yields to a pale, fleeting summer. I want you to imagine the peaceful, rhythmic morning on the holy island of Lindisfarne. The sky is a clear, cold blue. The tide is high, isolating the monastery from the mainland. The monks are going about their gentle routines. Some are kneeling in the stone chapel, murmuring their morning prayers, while others are out in the herb gardens pulling weeds from the damp earth. The only sounds are the rhythmic crashing of the waves, the cry of the gulls, and the soft, collective hum of Latin devotions. Then, someone looks out across the water. Breaking through the morning sea mist, a shadow appears. Then another. They are ships, but they are unlike the heavy, rounded merchant vessels the monks are used to seeing. These ships are terrifyingly sleek, impossibly long, and sit incredibly low in the water. They are carved with the fierce, snarling heads of dragons and sea serpents at their prows. A square, striped sail catches the wind, and along the sides, rows of wooden shields overlap like the scales of a great, terrible beast. I find it deeply unsettling to think about the sheer vulnerability of that moment. The monks of Lindisfarne had no walls, no standing army, and no weapons, save for the small knives they used to cut their bread and scrape their vellum. Their true defense was the supposed sanctity of their home. They believed that the sheer holiness of their island, built on the bones of St. Cuthbert, would protect them. But the men in those approaching ships did not worship the Christian God. They worshipped the old, wild gods of war and storm. The very same gods the Anglo-Saxons had abandoned centuries before. The shallow draught of the Viking longships allowed them to glide directly onto the pebbled beach of Lindisfarne, without needing a deep water port. The Norsemen leaped over the sides of their wooden vessels into the freezing surf. They were massive, hardened men, armed with heavy iron broadaxes, round shields, and deadly, single-edged swords. The peace of the morning was shattered instantly. What followed was not a battle. It was an absolute slaughter. The raiders stormed the monastery. They kicked down the heavy oak doors of the sanctuary. They cared nothing for the sacred nature of the altar. They saw only the glittering gold and silver crosses, the jewel-encrusted chalices, and the incredibly wealthy bindings of the holy books. Imagine the heartbreaking chaos inside the chapel. The air, once thick with incense, is now filled with the sound of splintering wood and the terrified screams of the brethren. The Norsemen stripped the gold from the altars and tore the precious gems from the covers of the Gospels, tossing the painstakingly illuminated pages onto the cold stone floor, to be trampled under muddy, blood-soaked leather boots. Those monks who were not struck down where they stood were bound with thick ropes to be dragged back to the ships and sold into slavery across the sea. In a matter of hours, the shining light of Northumbria, the greatest centre of learning in the Western world, was reduced to a smouldering, weeping ruin. The raiders pushed their heavy ships back into the surf, their holds overflowing with stolen wealth, and vanished back into the grey mist of the ocean, leaving only silence and devastation behind them. When news of the sack of Lindisfarne reached the mainland, and eventually crossed the sea to the courts of Europe, the psychological shockwave was absolutely immense. A famous Northumbrian scholar named Alcuin, who was serving in the court of Charlemagne in Francia at the time, wrote a letter that still echoes with raw, disbelieving grief. He wrote, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. Behold, the church of St. Cuthbert, spattered with the blood of the priests of God, despoiled of all its ornaments. It is a strange, cruel irony of history. The Anglo-Saxons were now experiencing the exact same terror that their own ancestors had inflicted upon the native Britons centuries earlier. Yet they struggled to comprehend it in those terms. To the deeply religious minds of the Anglo-Saxons, This sudden violence was not just a military failure. It was a profound spiritual crisis. Why had God allowed his holiest men to be slaughtered? The priests preached from their pulpits that the Vikings were a divine punishment, a scourge sent from heaven to punish the English kings for their sins, their infighting, and their greed. For the next several decades, this terror became a relentless, agonizing part of daily life. The Vikings utilized hit-and-run tactics that the slow, heavily armed Anglo-Saxon armies simply could not counter. The longships could navigate up the shallowest of rivers, striking deep into the heart of the countryside before any local lord could gather a fyrd or a peasant militia to respond. A village would hear the warning bells, see the smoke rising from the next valley over, and know that death was rushing toward them on the river current. By the time the local king arrived with his warriors, the village would be nothing but ash, and the raiders would be miles out to sea, laughing as they counted their silver. The 7 kingdoms of the Heptarchy were horribly unprepared for this. They were too fractured, too busy fighting petty border wars against one another to present a unified defense. A Mercian king would secretly rejoice if a Viking fleet sacked a West Saxon town, entirely failing to realize that the fire would eventually spread to his own borders. They tried paying the raiders off, handing over massive chests of silver, a practice that would become known as the Danegeld. But this only taught the Vikings that the island was a bottomless chest of treasure waiting to be opened, and soon the Norsemen realized that simply raiding the coasts was not enough. They looked at the green, fertile land of the Anglo-Saxons, the rich soil and the sprawling forests, and decided they no longer just wanted the silver. They wanted the kingdom itself. And so, in the year 865, the isolated, terrifying raids suddenly transformed into a full-scale invasion. A massive force which the terrified Anglo-Saxon chroniclers simply called the Great Heathen Army, arrived on the shores of East Anglia. This was not a handful of ships looking to steal silver from a coastal monastery. This was a coalition of seasoned Norse warriors, numbering in the thousands, led by figures whose very names still carry a dark, mythical weight. Men like Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, and Ubba, the alleged sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. I find it chilling to imagine the sheer scale of this fleet approaching the English coast. Instead of the frantic, chaotic smash-and-grab tactics of the past, this army operated with a cold, terrifying calculation. They landed, pulled hundreds of longships onto the beaches, established deeply entrenched fortified camps, and demanded that the local East Anglian king provide them with thousands of horses in exchange for a temporary peace. The king, horribly outnumbered and desperate to spare his people from immediate slaughter, complied. Picture that grim, humiliating transaction in the fading, grey autumn light. The Anglo-Saxon farmers, heads bowed in defeat and fear, handing over the leather reins of their sturdy agricultural horses to towering Norse warriors. In an instant, the Vikings mounted these beasts, transforming their heavy infantry into a highly mobile, unstoppable cavalry force, capable of striking anywhere inland. With their newly acquired mobility, the great heathen army did not return to the sea. Instead, they turned their collective gaze north, toward the sprawling, deeply divided kingdom of Northumbria. The timing of their attack was brilliantly, devastatingly opportunistic. Northumbria was currently tearing itself apart in a bitter, bloody civil war between two rival kings, Aella and Osbert. It is a tragic, recurring theme in human history that nations so often invite their own conquerors through bitter internal division. By the time the two rival Anglo-Saxon kings realized the true existential danger of the Norse army and finally united their forces, it was far too late. The Vikings struck the great Roman-walled city of York, a place the Norsemen would eventually claim and rename Jorvik. They attacked on the 1st of November, 867. Imagine the absolute chaos of that dark November day. The ancient Roman stone walls, which had stood as silent guardians for centuries, were violently breached. The narrow, muddy streets, usually filled with the comforting sounds of merchants and the soft chanting of monks, suddenly echoed with the terrifying clash of heavy iron axes against wooden linden shields and the agonizing screams of the dying. Both Anglo-Saxon kings were killed in the brutal, close-quarters fighting, and the fierce, proud kingdom of Northumbria, once the luminous center of the island's golden age, was utterly shattered. The great heathen army spent the winter in York, comfortably feasting in the mead halls of their conquered enemies, while the rest of the island watched in a state of paralyzed horror. When the thaw of spring finally arrived, they marched south into the massive central kingdom of Mercia. I always marvel at the terrifying efficiency and adaptability of the Norsemen. They were not just brutal warriors. They were brilliant logisticians. They began to utilize the ancient Roman road network, the very same paved roads the Anglo-Saxon had largely ignored and avoided for centuries, using them to move their massive army with astonishing, terrifying speed. They set up winter camps deep inland, forcing the Mercian king to empty his treasuries and pay an exorbitant Dangeld just to make them leave his borders. But the peace the Mercians bought with their silver was only an illusion, a brief, anxious pause, while the Vikings sharpened their axes and rested their horses. A few years later, the army returned to East Anglia, the very kingdom that had reluctantly given them their horses in the first place. The East Anglian king, a man named Edmund, was a deeply pious Christian who absolutely refused to become a puppet vassal to pagan overlords. The fate of King Edmund is one of the most haunting and brutal stories of the era. According to the later monastic chronicles, he was captured by the Norsemen, stripped of his royal garments, tied to a rough oak tree, and shot full of arrows until he bristled like a hedgehog, before finally being beheaded. He would later be venerated as Saint Edmund the Martyr, a symbol of pure, unbroken faith in the face of absolute darkness. Picture the absolute despair of the common Anglo-Saxon folk during these agonizing years. The horizon was constantly stained with the dark, greasy smoke of burning villages and plundered monasteries. The rivers, once the vital, bustling lifeblood of trade and communication, were now terrifying avenues of death, carrying longships deep into the countryside. The powerful, established kingdoms of the Heptarchy were falling like dominoes. By the late 870s, the political map of Britannia had been violently, permanently redrawn. The great northern kingdom of Northumbria was gone, absorbed into the Viking Empire. East Anglia was gone, ruled by Norse kings. The eastern half of Mercia had surrendered and collapsed. The only kingdom left standing, the absolute last flickering candle in the encroaching, freezing dark, was the southern kingdom of Wessex. The situation was incredibly, suffocatingly dire. The Viking army, now vastly enriched by plunder and reinforced by fresh ships, arriving continuously from Scandinavia, crossed the River Thames and pushed deep into West Saxon territory. They were absolutely intent on extinguishing this final pocket of Anglo-Saxon resistance and claiming the entire island for themselves. The fate of England, the very possibility of a unified nation ever being called England, hung entirely by a fraying thread. It rested squarely upon the shoulders of the royal house of Wessex, and eventually upon the shoulders of a young, quiet, scholarly prince who never in his life expected to be a king. That young, quiet, scholarly prince was named Alfred. When we look back at the grand, sweeping narrative of history, it is so incredibly easy to view the great figures as inevitable, as if they were born with their destiny already carved into heavy stone. But Alfred was never meant to wear the crown. He was the youngest of 5 brothers, an afterthought in the dangerous line of succession. As a young boy, he was not known for his prowess with an iron broadsword or his booming, confident voice in the smoky Mead halls. Instead, he was a deeply devout and introspective child, entirely fascinated by the quiet, orderly, and beautifully illuminated world of the monks. He loved the rich, earthy smell of old vellum, the beautiful sweeping curves of Latin letters, and the complex, riddle-filled poetry of his Anglo-Saxon ancestors. I often wonder what kind of man he would have become if the dark, dragon-headed sails of the Northmen had never appeared on the horizon. Perhaps he would have simply become a bishop or a quiet scholar, spending his days in a freezing scriptorium, happily far away from the blood, the mud, and the terrifying roar of the battlefield. But history, as it so often does, had a far heavier, much darker burden waiting for him. As the great heathen army relentlessly battered against the fragile borders of Wessex, young Alfred was forced to watch his older brothers take the throne one by one. And one by one, he watched them fall, their bodies and spirits completely consumed by the agonizing, ceaseless stress of endless warfare. By the year 871, a harrowing period that the Anglo-Saxon chroniclers often remember simply as the year of battles. The massive Viking horde was pushing deep into West Saxon territory. The situation was unimaginably desperate. The fields were left unplowed. The villages were emptied of their men, and a heavy, suffocating blanket of dread hung over the kingdom. It was during the freezing, brutal month of January that the young Prince Alfred finally had to step out from behind the safe shadow of his books and onto the bloody, frost-covered stage of history at a place called Ashdown. The Viking army had arrived first and seized the tactical high ground, a sprawling, steep ridge dotted with ancient, stunted thorn trees, whose bare branches clawed at the grey winter sky. Below them, at the bottom of the icy hill, the Anglo-Saxon army formed their shield wall. I want you to picture the sheer, terrifying, claustrophobic reality of an Anglo-Saxon shield wall. It was not a loose, chaotic skirmish of individual heroes. It was a suffocating, incredibly dense block of breathing humanity. Men stood tightly shoulder to shoulder, their heavy, painted wooden shields overlapping, to create an almost impenetrable wooden rampart. If you were standing in that line, you could smell the cold sweat, the raw, metallic scent of fear, and the damp, dirty wool of the man trembling next to you. Alfred's older brother, the current King Ethelred, was inside his royal leather tent, stubbornly refusing to join the battle until the attending priests had finished singing the Holy Mass. But up on the ridge, the Vikings were beginning to advance. They were beating their heavy iron axes rhythmically against their wooden shields, sending a terrifying, thrumming, booming sound echoing down the frosty hill. A sound designed to completely shatter the nerves of the men waiting below. Alfred, acting as the second in command, realized with sudden, chilling clarity that if they waited any longer, the Norsemen would charge down the slope and crush the West Saxon army under their sheer downhill momentum. And so, with a voice that perhaps trembled just a little, in the freezing morning air, the young scholar ordered his men to advance. He ordered the heavy, exhausted West Saxon shield wall to charge straight up the hill. Imagine the absolute, lung-burning physical agony of that uphill charge, hundreds of men running upward in heavy iron ringmail, their leather boots slipping wildly in the freezing mud, and the crushed, frosty grass lunging straight into a solid wall of hostile iron and painted wood. The two shield walls crashed together with a deafening, sickening sound, like a great ancient oak forest being ripped apart by a violent storm. The fighting at Ashdown was incredibly intimate and brutally violent. It was a crushing, suffocating press of bodies where men had no room to swing an axe, instead stabbing desperately at each other over the rims of their splintering shields with short iron swords and heavy ash spears. Against all odds, Alfred's desperate ferocity broke the Viking lines. The shield wall of the Northmen shattered, and they fled into the gathering dusk, leaving thousands of their dead scattered across the bloody frost. It was a miraculous, breathtaking victory. But it was a tragically fleeting one. Just a few short months later, shortly after the holy season of Easter, King Ethelred died, his body finally giving out under the relentless, crushing exhaustion of the campaign. And suddenly, at the fragile age of 22, the young, quiet scholar who loved books found the heavy, blood-stained crown of Wessex placed upon his head. He was now King Alfred. But he did not inherit a kingdom of vast wealth and joyful stability. He inherited a desperate, bleeding, traumatized nation that was teetering on the absolute brink of total annihilation. I am deeply moved by the tragic, somber reality of his coronation. There were no grand, weeks-long feasts. There were no gold-drenched celebrations or joyful songs echoing in the Mead halls. He was crowned in the dark shadow of a losing war, while Viking raiding parties continued to ravage the edges of his lands. Recognizing the grim, inescapable reality that his army was completely exhausted and depleted of fighting men, the new King Alfred was forced to do the most humiliating thing a proud Saxon king could do. He sent messengers to the Viking warlords and sued for peace. Picture the heavy, humiliating silence inside the royal hall as Alfred was forced to watch his treasurers weigh out a massive fortune in silver. On small bronze scales, the Vikings demanded what was known as hack silver. Silver coins, broken jewelry, and melted crosses from the churches, all weighed precisely to satisfy their immense greed. Alfred watched the smirking, towering Norsemen carry away the wealth of his kingdom in heavy leather sacks. He had bought a fragile, incredibly expensive temporary peace. But as he watched them ride away, the young king knew deep in his heart that he had not stopped the tide. He had merely bought a little bit of time, knowing with absolute certainty that the wolves would inevitably return once the silver ran out. That time bought with silver was an agonizing, breathless, waiting game. Alfred knew the peace was merely an illusion. The Viking warlord Guthrum took his forces and moved northward and eastward, dividing up the lands of Mercia and East Anglia, giving their warriors plots of earth to farm. This vast swath of the island became known as the Danelaw, a place where Norse customs, language, and laws completely overwrote the old Anglo-Saxon ways. But Guthrum's eyes remained fixed on the green hills of Wessex. He was a patient, calculating predator. He waited for the exact moment when the West Saxons would be most vulnerable. Their guard entirely lowered. That moment arrived in the freezing, bitter depths of winter, in the first week of January, 878. It was the holy season of Twelfth Night. The royal court of Wessex was celebrating at the royal estate of Chippenham. The mead halls were warm, the drinking horns were full, and the heavy winter snow outside offered a false sense of absolute security. In those days, no army marched in the dead of winter. The mud was too thick, the frost too biting, and the roads impassable. But the Vikings were not a conventional army. In a brilliant, devastating tactical move, Guthrum launched a massive, lightning-fast surprise attack through the freezing snow straight into the heart of Chippenham. The suddenness of the assault was absolutely terrifying. There was no time to form a shield wall. There was no time to send riders out to gather the peasant militia. The Norsemen flooded into the royal estate, their iron axes swinging in the pale, blinding winter light. The slaughter was immense. Many of the king's loyal thanes were cut down where they stood, still wearing their festive garments. Others surrendered immediately, utterly broken by the surprise. But Alfred, grasping the terrifying reality that his death meant the absolute end of England, managed to escape the slaughter. With only a tiny, terrified handful of his closest companions, the young king fled into the freezing, dark wilderness. When I reflect on this specific moment, it strikes me as the absolute nadir, the darkest, lowest point in the entire history of the English people. The great King of Wessex, the last surviving heir of the Heptarchy, was reduced to a hunted fugitive shivering in the damp woods with nothing but the clothes on his back and the sword in his hand. Alfred and his small band of survivors pushed deep into the west, plunging into the vast, inhospitable wetlands of the Somerset levels. Picture this incredibly desolate landscape. It was a massive, sprawling expanse of tidal marshes, peat bogs, and twisting, muddy waterways. The air smelled heavily of rotting reeds, damp earth, and salt. The winter mist hung so low and thick that you could barely see the hand in front of your face. Here, completely surrounded by miles of freezing, treacherous swamp, Alfred found a tiny, elevated patch of solid ground known as Athelney. They built a rough, miserable shelter of woven willow and mud. They survived by foraging for whatever meager roots and fish the freezing marsh would yield, living no better than the poorest, most desperate outcasts of the realm. It is from this miserable, mud-soaked period that the famous legend of Alfred and the cakes emerges. The story goes that the disguised king, deeply lost in despairing thoughts about his ruined kingdom, was scolded by a peasant woman for letting her bread burn in the hearth fire. While historians debate whether this actually happened, I find the story incredibly poignant. It beautifully captures the psychological truth of the moment. Here was a monarch whose entire world had burned to ashes, so consumed by the sheer crushing weight of his failure that he could not even focus on a simple, glowing ember. But the freezing mud of Athelney did not become his grave. It became his crucible. Alfred did not surrender to the dark. Slowly, agonizingly, he began to organize a resistance from the shadows of the marsh. The tables of history were suddenly, ironically turned. Now it was the Anglo-Saxons who became the unseen raiders. Alfred and his men began launching swift, brutal guerrilla attacks against Viking patrols that dared to venture too close to the swamps. They would strike silently from the thick mist and vanish back into the tall reeds before the Norsemen even knew what had hit them. From his muddy island fortress, Alfred began to secretly send messengers out across the occupied shires. These men slipped through the dark forests and across the frozen hills, carrying a quiet, desperate whisper of hope. The king is alive. The king is hiding in the marshes. The king calls upon his people to fight. And miraculously, the people listened. After months of suffering, under the brutal, heavy hand of Norse occupation, the men of the surrounding shires began to secretly sharpen their rusted spears and repair their splintered shields. They were preparing for one final, desperate throw of the dice. The agonizing winter finally broke, yielding to the damp, muddy thaw of early May. It was the year 878. Alfred sent his final, most urgent summons into the shires of Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire. He called every able-bodied man who had not yet submitted to the Norsemen to meet him at a place known as Egbert's Stone, deep in the ancient, primeval forest of Selwood. I want you to picture the sheer emotional weight of that gathering. For months, these men had believed their king was dead and their country lost forever. They arrived at the meeting place, exhausted, terrified, and armed with whatever weapons they could scavenge: hunting spears, rusty farm axes, and old, dented shields. As they stood in the cool, green shadow of the ancient trees, a figure emerged from the dense undergrowth. It was Alfred. He was no longer the soft, scholarly prince in clean robes. He was weathered, mud-stained, his beard long and untrimmed, his eyes hardened by months of miserable survival in the swamps. The Anglo-Saxon chronicler Asser wrote that when the men saw their king alive, they received him like one who had risen from the dead. The forest must have echoed with a quiet, fierce, and desperate joy. They had nothing left to lose. They would follow him into the fire. Alfred did not waste a single moment. He immediately organized this ragged, desperate militia into a cohesive fighting force and marched them out of the forest, heading directly toward Guthrum's massive Viking army at a place called Edington. This was it. There would be no more retreats, no more Dangeld, no more hiding in the reeds. This was a single, winner-take-all collision for the absolute survival of the English people. The Battle of Edington was fought with a ferocity born of utter desperation. The West Saxons formed a massive, solid shield wall, an impenetrable wall of painted wood and cold iron. When the Viking army slammed into them, the sound was like the shattering of the earth itself. The fighting lasted for hours. It was a suffocating, brutal, grinding nightmare of close-quarters combat. Men slipped and died in the muddy grass, screaming as iron hacked into bone. But this time, the West Saxon line did not break. Driven by the sheer, unyielding will of a king who had lost everything and clawed his way back from the mud, the Anglo-Saxons held firm. Slowly, agonizingly, they began to push forward. Guthrum's warriors, accustomed to the swift, easy slaughter of terrified peasants, found themselves facing a solid, unbroken wall of men who simply refused to die. The Viking lines finally buckled, shattered and broke. The Norsemen turned and fled, completely routed, seeking refuge behind the heavy timber walls of a nearby fortress. Alfred, showing a terrifying, cold-blooded, tactical brilliance he had never displayed before, did not just let them go. He immediately ordered his exhausted men to surround the fortress. They cut off all food and water, settling in for a grim starvation siege. For 14 agonizing days, the Vikings starved behind their wooden walls. Finally, broken by hunger and absolute defeat, the great warlord Guthrum sued for peace. But Alfred, remembering the bitter lessons of the past, knew that silver would not buy a lasting peace. He demanded something far more profound. He demanded that Guthrum and his top commanders convert to Christianity, and that Guthrum be baptized with Alfred standing as his godfather. It was a brilliant masterstroke of political psychology. By bringing the pagan warlord into the Christian fold, Alfred was forcing Guthrum to submit to the very spiritual and cultural framework that the Vikings had previously sought to destroy. Guthrum was baptized, taking the Christian name Athelstan, and he kept his word. He withdrew his forces entirely from Wessex and retreated back into the Danelaw. Wessex was saved. The kingdom had survived the absolute darkest night. But Alfred knew with chilling certainty that surviving one battle was not the same as securing a nation. The Vikings were still out there, occupying half the island, and they would eventually return. To ensure the survival of his people, Alfred realized he had to fundamentally, radically transform the very fabric of his kingdom. He recognized that the old, chaotic system of calling up a peasant militia, only when danger was at the door, was a recipe for slaughter. He needed a standing army, and he needed impenetrable defences. He began the massive, monumental task of building the burh system. Across the entire kingdom of Wessex, Alfred ordered the construction of fortified, garrisoned towns called burhs. He strategically placed them so that no farm or village in his entire realm was more than 20 miles. A single day's hard march from a heavily defended, walled stronghold. Picture the incredible amount of sweat and labor this required. Thousands of men digging massive earthen ditches, throwing up towering timber palisades, and restoring the crumbling ancient Roman stone walls in places like Winchester and London. He fundamentally reshaped the landscape of England, turning a soft, vulnerable kingdom into a rigid, bristling fortress. But Alfred did not stop at simply building walls of earth and timber. He understood, with a profound visionary clarity that was centuries ahead of its time, that a kingdom is not truly defended by swords alone. It is defended by its mind. When he looked around his ravaged, war-torn kingdom, he saw an intellectual desolation that terrified him just as much as the Viking longships. Years of relentless raiding had destroyed the great monasteries. The magnificent libraries of Northumbria were ashes. The priests who had once chanted in fluent Latin could now barely read the holy texts they were reciting. The flame of knowledge, the very soul of the Anglo-Saxon culture, was sputtering out. I find this aspect of Alfred's character to be his absolute greatest triumph. He was a warrior out of terrifying necessity, but he was a scholar at his very core. He believed that the Viking invasions were a divine punishment brought upon his people because they had turned away from learning and wisdom. And so, in the midst of a fragile peace, surrounded by enemies, King Alfred launched an astonishing, revolutionary educational program. He didn't just want his priests to learn Latin. He wanted his noblemen, his ealdormen, and his judges to learn to read. And crucially, he made the incredibly radical decision that they should not learn in the difficult, alien tongue of Latin, but in the language they actually spoke. English. Picture the king himself, sitting in a quiet, candlelit room in his rebuilt palace at Winchester. He is surrounded by scholars he has painstakingly recruited from Mercia, Wales, and even from the continent of Europe. Together, they are embarking on a monumental translation project. The king is personally translating massive, philosophical works like The Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius and The Pastoral Care of Pope Gregory the Great from Latin into Old English. It is a stunning image, a medieval warlord, a man who had personally driven an iron spear into the chest of an enemy, sitting quietly, agonizing over the precise translation of a philosophical concept, desperate to provide his people with the intellectual tools they needed to rebuild their society. He wrote in his own preface that he wanted all the free-born young men in England to be set to learning until they could read well in English. This was the true birth of English prose, to ensure that the history of his people would never again be erased by fire and axe. Alfred also commissioned a massive, ongoing historical record known as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. The Chronicle was not just a dry list of dates. It was the living, breathing, collective memory of the nation. Scribes across the kingdom were instructed to record the events of their time, the battles, the famines, the comets in the sky, and the deaths of kings. Copies of these chronicles were chained to reading desks in monasteries and churches across Wessex, ensuring that even if one was burned by raiders, the memory of the people would survive elsewhere. The transformation of the kingdom was absolutely staggering. Alfred had taken a fractured, dying society hiding in the swamps and forged it into an incredibly resilient, organized, and culturally vibrant nation. When the Vikings inevitably returned in the 890s, launching massive new invasions with fresh fleets from the continent, they found a completely different Wessex waiting for them. The new Viking armies landed expecting the easy pickings of the past. Instead, they found a landscape dotted with impenetrable, heavily garrisoned burhs. When they tried to use the rivers to strike inland, they found their paths blocked by fortified bridges. When they tried to outrun the Anglo-Saxon armies, they found a newly organized, highly mobile fighting force that was always one step ahead of them. And most remarkably, Alfred had ordered the construction of a new fleet of ships. They were larger, higher, and more stable than the Viking longships, designed specifically to meet the Norsemen on the chaotic, violent waters of the open ocean before they could ever reach the shore. The Vikings battered against the defences of Wessex for 4 exhausting years, but they simply could not break through. Finally, demoralized and defeated by the very system Alfred had built, the Viking armies fractured and dispersed, many of them sailing away to try their luck across the Channel in Francia. King Alfred died in the year 899. He was a man who had suffered from chronic, agonizing physical pain his entire life. Yet he had carried the absolute, crushing weight of an entire nation on his shoulders. He is the only English monarch in history to be given the title the Great, and it is a title that is entirely deserved. He did not conquer an empire. He did not build massive stone pyramids. His greatness lay in sheer, unyielding endurance. He saved the idea of England from total annihilation, and he planted the intellectual and organizational seeds that would eventually grow into a unified nation. He left his kingdom to his incredibly capable son, Edward, and his brilliant, fiercely intelligent daughter, Ethelfled, who would carry his vision forward. The transition of power following Alfred's death could easily have been a moment of fatal weakness. In the brutal, unstable world of the 10th century, the death of a strong king often meant immediate civil war and the complete collapse of everything he had built. But Alfred had prepared his children well. His son, Edward the Elder, ascended to the throne of Wessex. Edward lacked his father's deep, quiet scholarly introspection, but he inherited his incredible tactical brilliance and his ruthless, unyielding determination to expand the borders of their realm. However, the true, unexpected powerhouse of this generation was not Edward, but his sister, Ethelfled. When I read the chronicles of this era, she is the figure who absolutely commands my attention. She had been married off to Athelred, the ruler of the massive neighboring kingdom of Mercia, in a brilliant political move by her father to bind the two remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdoms together. When her husband grew sick and eventually died, Ethelfled did not retreat to a nunnery, as was the usual fate for a royal widow. Instead, in a move that was entirely unprecedented and completely astonishing. For the time, she simply took control of Mercia herself. She was recognized by her people not as a queen consort, but as the Lady of the Mercians. This was a society deeply entrenched in patriarchal warrior values. Men followed strength, and they followed the sword. The fact that the fiercely proud Mercian warlords chose to follow a woman, to ride into battle under her banner, speaks volumes about her sheer, terrifying competence and her undeniable charisma. She was her father's daughter through and through, working in a brilliant, synchronized, and devastating partnership. Edward and Ethelfled began the systematic, incredibly violent reconquest of the Danelaw. Picture a massive map of Britannia slowly being painted over. For decades, the Vikings had dictated the terms of war. Now, the Anglo-Saxons were the aggressors. They used Alfred's brilliant system of fortified burhs, not just as a defense, but as a slow, creeping offensive weapon. They would march a massive army into Viking-held territory, immediately construct a new, heavily fortified burh, garrison it with soldiers, and essentially lock down the surrounding countryside. They choked the life out of the Norse settlements, one by one. The campaigns of the Lady of the Mercians were legendary. She personally led her armies into the field. Imagine the sheer, awe-inspiring sight of her. She was not a delicate princess watching from a distant hill. She was wrapped in heavy furs and chainmail, riding at the head of a massive Mercian army, directing sieges against heavily fortified Viking strongholds like Derby and Leicester. The Norsemen, completely unprepared for this synchronized, relentless pressure from both the south and the west, began to crack. One by one, the great Viking warlords of the Danelaw surrendered, handing over hostages and swearing oaths of loyalty to Edward and Ethelfled. By the time Edward died in the year 924, followed shortly after by his brilliant sister, the political landscape of the island had been completely transformed once again. The great Viking armies of the East and the Midlands had been entirely broken and subdued. The Kingdom of Wessex had absorbed Mercia, East Anglia, and the southern half of the old Northumbrian kingdom. The idea of a single unified nation, a concept that Alfred had merely dreamed of in the freezing swamps of Athelney, was suddenly, incredibly, becoming a tangible reality. This massive, sprawling new kingdom fell to Edward's son, a man named Athelstan. And it is under Athelstan that we can finally truly say the word England, and mean it in a political sense. He is generally recognized by historians as the very first true king of the English. Athelstan was a towering figure, a brilliant, highly educated, and deeply ambitious monarch who sought to project his power not just across the island, but across the entire continent of Europe. Athelstan's court was a magnificent, glittering center of diplomacy and culture. He collected holy relics from across Christendom with an almost obsessive zeal. He married his half-sisters into the greatest royal houses of Europe, to the King of the Franks, the Duke of the Franks, and the future Holy Roman Emperor. He was forging a deep, powerful network of alliances that made the young Kingdom of England an incredibly influential player on the world stage. But absolute power always breeds deep, terrifying resentment. And in the north, the remaining independent powers were watching the rapid, terrifying expansion of the English kingdom with growing, desperate alarm. The Scottish kings in the north, the Celtic rulers of Strathclyde, and the fierce Norse Gael warlords of Dublin realized that if they did not unite to crush Athelstan, they would inevitably be swallowed by the massive English war machine. And so, they formed a massive, unprecedented coalition, an incredibly huge army of Scots, Celts, and Vikings, men who had previously hated and fought each other for generations, united under a single banner for one terrifying purpose: the total destruction of the new English kingdom. They marched south in the year 937, entirely intent on drowning the dream of a unified England in a massive sea of blood. King Athelstan did not waver in the face of this overwhelming, apocalyptic threat. He knew with absolute certainty that this collision was inevitable. The entire island was holding its breath, waiting to see if this grand, fragile experiment of a unified England would simply shatter under the weight of foreign axes, or if it had the deep, iron roots necessary to stand its ground. He sent out his messengers across the sprawling length of his new realm, calling up the greatest army the Anglo-Saxons had ever assembled. For the very first time in history, the men of Wessex and the men of Mercia did not march as uneasy allies. They marched shoulder to shoulder as Englishmen. They met the massive invasion force at a place called Brunanburh in the late summer of 937. To this day, the exact physical location of the battlefield is a fiercely debated mystery among historians, lost somewhere under the soil of northern England. But what is not a mystery is the sheer, staggering scale of the slaughter. The Anglo-Saxon chroniclers, usually quite reserved in their descriptions, absolutely exhausted their vocabulary, trying to capture the horror and the magnitude of this confrontation. They called it, simply, the Great Battle. I always find it deeply haunting to think about the morning of that fight. Picture a vast, uneven field covered in early morning mist, the damp grass heavy with dew. The silence is broken only by the nervous shifting of thousands of men, the clinking of chainmail, and the harsh, guttural cries of the Norse and Scottish commanders working their men into a battle frenzy. Across the field stands the English shield wall, an immense, terrifying, unbroken line of painted wood and cold iron, stretching as far as the eye can see. In the center stands King Athelstan and his young brother Edmund, their royal banners snapping in the cold wind. When the two massive armies finally crashed into each other, the sound must have been heard for miles. It was not a battle of complex tactical maneuvers. It was an absolute, grueling, agonizing test of endurance. It was a grinding, suffocating press of human flesh and shattered wood that lasted from the moment the sun rose until it finally began to set. Men died in the thousands in the crushing, muddy center of the field, the grass turning into a slick, horrifying paste of dark earth and blood. There is a famous poem recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that describes the battle. The poet writes of how the sun, the bright candle of God, glided across the sky, completely indifferent to the agonizing butchery happening beneath it. As the afternoon wore heavily on, the sheer, unyielding discipline of the English shield wall began to break the will of the coalition. The Norse Gael warriors, exhausted and battered by the relentless West Saxon advance, began to falter. The Scottish lines buckled, and then, the coalition completely shattered, the battle turned into a chaotic, terrifying rout. I am always struck by the terrifying efficiency of the Anglo-Saxon pursuit. The English cavalry chased the fleeing Norsemen and Scots for miles across the darkening landscape, hacking them down without mercy as they scrambled desperately for the safety of their ships. 5 young kings of the coalition lay dead in the mud alongside 7 of the Norse earls, and countless thousands of ordinary men who had travelled so far from their homes only to feed the ravens of Britain. The image of those ravens is permanently etched into the history of this era. Imagine the grim, devastating aftermath of the battle as the sun finally dips below the horizon, casting the bruised purple and blood-red light of dusk over the field. A heavy, terrible silence falls over the landscape, broken only by the groans of the dying and the harsh, dark cawing of massive flocks of carrion birds. The Anglo-Saxon poet describes the dark-coated raven, the eagle with the white tail, and the greedy warhawk descending from the sky to feast upon the corpses. It is a profoundly dark, brutally honest reflection on the true cost of kingship and the heavy price of survival. With the staggering victory at Brunanburh, the existential threat to England was completely annihilated. The Scottish King Constantine fled back to his mountains in the north, deeply humiliated and mourning the loss of his own son on the battlefield. The Norse King Olaf escaped with a tiny, terrified remnant of his fleet back across the Irish Sea to Dublin. King Athelstan and his brother Edmund returned to Wessex in absolute, undisputed triumph. Athelstan now stood at the absolute zenith of Anglo-Saxon power. He was not just a king of a tribe or a region, he was the unquestioned master of the entire island of Britain. He struck new silver coins, proclaiming his grand new title in Latin, Rex Totius Britannia, the king of all Britain. He had taken the fractured, burning, terrified world of his grandfather Alfred and forged it into a recognized, powerful European state. For a brief golden period, the island experienced a profound sense of unity and peace. The monasteries were rebuilt, filled once again with the soft chanting of monks and the scratching of quills on fresh vellum. The trade routes flourished, and the English people began to truly believe that the darkest days of the Norse terror were permanently behind them. They had endured the fire, and they had emerged as a single, hardened blade. But history, like the dark, churning waters of the North Sea, is rarely ever truly still. The Anglo-Saxon age was approaching its twilight, and the deepest, most devastating storm was still waiting just over the horizon. The peace that Athelstan had forged was beautiful, but, like all beautiful things in this brutal age, it was fragile. As the 10th century bled into the 11th, the dark, churning waters of the North Sea brought a terrifying resurgence of the Viking threat. This was not the chaotic, disorganized raiding of the past, nor was it a fractured, heathen army looking for farmland. This was the highly organized, incredibly wealthy, and ruthlessly efficient war machine of the Danish royal house. The English kings who followed Athelstan, men like Athold the Unready, found themselves completely overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the new invasions. They resorted to the old, desperate tactics, paying unimaginable fortunes in silver Danegeld to buy peace, essentially bleeding the wealth of the island dry. But the silver was never enough. In the year 1016, the unthinkable happened. The English defences finally collapsed entirely, and a Danish king named Knut the Great took the throne of England, absorbing the island into a massive, sprawling North Sea empire that included Denmark and Norway. Yet, I find it fascinating that the Anglo-Saxon culture did not simply vanish under Danish rule. Knut was a brutal conqueror, but he was also a remarkably shrewd and adaptable king. He ruled England not as a foreign tyrant, but as a traditional Anglo-Saxon monarch. He upheld the old laws, patronized the monasteries, and even married Ethelred's widow. The island simply absorbed him, as the deep, dark soil of Britain always seems to absorb its conquerors. When Knut's line eventually failed, the English crown returned to the old House of Wessex, falling upon the quiet, deeply religious head of Edward the Confessor. Edward was a man who seemed entirely out of place in a world of iron and blood. He was ascetic, deeply pious, and far more interested in the architecture of heaven than the muddy politics of earth. His greatest legacy was not a battlefield victory or a new code of law, but a building. He poured the vast wealth of his kingdom into constructing a magnificent, towering stone abbey on the marshy banks of the River Thames, a place known as the Westminster. Picture the staggering scale of this construction. It was built in the grand, sweeping Romanesque style, with massive, heavy stone arches and thick, imposing pillars. Imagine the hundreds of stonemasons, carpenters, and labourers swarming over the wooden scaffolding, hoisting massive blocks of pale stone into the grey London sky. The air is thick, with the sound of ringing hammers, the shouting of foremen, and the fine, white dust of carved limestone. Edward poured his absolute soul into this abbey, creating a spiritual heart for the nation that still beats to this very day. But Edward was childless, and as he lay dying in his newly finished palace in the freezing first days of January 1066, the kingdom was plunged into a terrifying existential crisis. The throne was empty, and the hungry wolves were circling. The English nobles, the Witan, desperately gave the crown to the most powerful warlord in the kingdom, an Anglo-Saxon nobleman named Harold Godwinson. But across the narrow English Channel, in the powerful, heavily militarized Duchy of Normandy, a man named Duke William claimed that the throne had been promised to him. The year 1066 is the most famous date in English history, and for good reason. It is the twilight of the gods. In the spring of that year, a terrifying omen appeared in the sky. Halley's comet blazed across the heavens, its long, fiery tail visible even in the pale daylight. The Anglo-Saxon monks looked up from their vellum pages, their faces bathed in the eerie light, and recorded it with absolute dread, believing it to be a divine warning of unimaginable disaster. They were entirely correct. In the late summer, a massive Viking fleet, led by the King of Norway, invaded the north of England. King Harold Godwinson performed an absolute military miracle. He force-marched his entire Anglo-Saxon army hundreds of miles north in just a few days, catching the Vikings completely by surprise at Stamford Bridge and utterly destroying them. But the celebration was cut tragically short as Harold rested his exhausted, bleeding army in the north. A messenger arrived with terrifying news. The wind in the south had finally changed. Duke William of Normandy had crossed the Channel with thousands of heavily armoured knights and landed on the southern coast. Harold immediately turned his battered, exhausted men around and marched them all the way back down the length of the country. It was an agonizing, lung-burning race against time. They met the Norman army on the 14th of October, 1066, on a grassy ridge known as Senlac Hill, near a place that would forever be known simply as Battle. I want you to close your eyes and picture that final, heartbreaking stand of the Anglo-Saxon world. The English army is positioned at the top of the hill. They form one last, magnificent shield wall. It is a solid, unbroken line of painted wooden shields and fierce, exhausted men. They stand shoulder to shoulder, just as their ancestors had done for 600 years, gripping their heavy iron axes. Below them, at the bottom of the hill, the Norman army waits. They are a terrifying new breed of warrior. Heavily armoured knights, sitting atop massive war horses, supported by ranks of archers. The battle raged for the entire day. The English shield wall, held with breathtaking, desperate courage, repelling charge after charge of the Norman cavalry. But as the afternoon sun began to sink, the Normans changed their tactics. They fired their arrows, not straight at the wall, but high up into the air, allowing them to rain down vertically upon the unprotected heads of the English defenders. The Anglo-Saxon lines finally buckled. In the chaotic, bloody twilight, King Harold Godwinson was struck down, his royal banner falling into the muddy, blood-soaked grass. With the death of their king, the last Anglo-Saxon shield wall finally shattered. The Normans rode through the fleeing survivors, and the sun officially set on the age of the Anglo-Saxons. William the Conqueror marched to London and was crowned King of England in the very abbey that Edward the Confessor had just built. The Norman conquest was a brutal, total decapitation of the English state. The new French-speaking lords took the lands, built massive, crushing stone castles, and imposed their own heavy laws upon the people. But when we look back across the vast expanse of time, we realize something incredibly beautiful and deeply comforting. The Anglo-Saxons did not truly disappear. The Norman lords may have ruled from their high stone towers, but down in the valleys, in the damp, fertile fields, the ordinary people simply carried on. They continued to plough the dark earth. They continued to spin their wool by the firelight. And, most importantly, they continued to speak their own language, the language of the Normans, mingled with the earthy, guttural tongue of the Anglo-Saxons. But it was the English language that eventually triumphed, carrying the old words for home, earth, fire, and water into the modern world. The legacy of the Anglo-Saxons is not found in grand standing ruins. It is found in the very soil of the island. It is found in the twisting, ancient hedgerows, the winding country lanes, and the quiet, mist-covered villages ending in Ham and Tun. They are the invisible, foundational bedrock of a nation. As we leave the damp, dark forests of early Britain behind, I want you to let the sounds of the clashing shields and the crashing waves simply fade away into the deep, quiet mist. The fires in the Mead halls have long since burned out, leaving only warm, glowing embers. The monks have closed their heavy, leather-bound books. The island is completely at peace, wrapped in the quiet, absolute stillness of the night. Let the history of the past sink deep into the earth, and let your own mind drift away into a calm, restful sleep.